Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Astral Observatory, the weekly show where I sit down and give my opinion on something related to Legend of Zelda. And this week we're going to be talking about another pretty contentious topic, and that is whether Breath of the Wild has a good story or not. Now, I think the argument about whether Breath of the Wild has a good story is an argument that most people know, but the idea behind it is that the game doesn't really have much of substance, especially compared to the old games. The common complaint is that there are only 4 divine beasts, which means there are only 4 sort of storylines. Whereas if you think about something like Ocarina of Time, for example, where there are pretty close to a dozen temples, each one being in either a separate area or in an area that you've been to already that has changed radically. For example, going to Jabu Jabu's belly as a kid while Zora's domain is thriving, as opposed to going to the water temple later while Zora's domain is frozen over, or the Goron temple where the Gorons are thriving and then the Gorons are being kidnapped and presumably eaten by Volvagia. And so due to the game's sort of small amount of proper temples, that naturally leads to a small amount of story content, and that's not really something that you can argue against. There certainly is a lot less story to the game. There are all the cutscenes with Zelda and Link, and those definitely add a lot extra that contextualize things, but even then that only really goes to contextualize the relationship between Link and Zelda. So I do understand where people are coming from when they say that Breath of the Wild has a bad story. And that might seem weird to some of you because you might sort of mostly be looking at a lot of the popular reviews that do say the game has a good story. But if you want to see criticism of the game, and usually pretty well written criticism, just check out a sort of obsessive Reddit or forum like r/TrueZelda or something like that, where people, aren't afraid to be a little bit more critical of the games than they are normally. And you'll see that there are a lot of people dumping on the game pretty severely. Now, personally, do I think that Breath of the Wild has a bad story? Yes and no. And I know that's kind of an unsatisfying answer, but I hope to explain myself a little bit. To me, the most important thing is to point out that there is a difference between narrative, plot, and story. And if you Google these things and you Google what the difference is between them, you're going to get different descriptions of them from different academic sources. So I'm going to tell you how I've learned what they are, just so we're on the same page going forward. So to me, narrative, plot, and story are 3 different things. The narrative of a piece of work is the sort of moment-to-moment actions and interactions that make up the events that are being told. If you were to take Star Wars, for example, the narrative would be first the Empire arrives on the Rebel ship, and then Darth Vader storms through the Rebel ship, killing all the rebels, and then R2-D2 and C-3PO flee, and then R2-D2, C-3PO take the message to Tatooine. Each of those individual story beats is an element of the narrative. And then the plot is all the pieces of narrative taken together and related to each other. So the plot is how the narrative beats relate to each other, which makes total sense, right? A plot about, let's say, a fellowship of people going to Mount Doom to destroy a ring, when you're thinking of the plot, you're not going to think of the individual scenes, you're going to think of the entire overarching storyline, whereas the narrative is those individual sort of beats. So the plot is all of the narrative beats put together and contextualized. And then you have the story. What the story is, as far as I've learned, is the story is the plot and narrative as well as everything else. So the story is sort of the all-encompassing everything of the piece of work. So the story is the narrative and plot, and that's probably half of what makes it up. The story is also the characters. The story is also the themes. The story is absolutely everything. And because those 3 things are different, I can't say that I think Breath of the Wild has a bad story. I think Breath of the Wild has a terrible, terrible plot, and I think a lot of the narrative is bad, but I think the story as a whole is good, and I'd like to explain why. So the best way to go through this is to go through the narrative, the plot, and then the story, and sort of give my defense. So we'll start off with the narrative, the individual sort of story beats of the entire thing. So the narrative honestly isn't completely bad. It's more of a mixed bag to me. The game certainly starts off strong with Link waking up and meeting the old man, and then the big twist with the old man that he's King Hyrule is obviously everybody saw it coming, but it doesn't make it less of an exciting moment. But after that, the narrative starts getting pretty damn messy. They have individual narrative beats within the story that are actually pretty interesting and exciting, especially the ones involving the actual divine beasts and dealing with the descendants of the champions. There's also a lot of long exposition dumps where not much happens, and honestly my biggest problem with it is just how much happens before you're even playing the game. Like, there's so little that you're actually experiencing through the story because most of it has happened before the story even begins, which is obviously a little frustrating. But like I said, I really do want to emphasize that not all of the narrative beats are bad. Actually, quite a lot of the narrative beats are really, really good. For example, take the story of Cass, going around Hyrule trying to fulfill the promise he made to his old teacher, and you get to encounter him in the various different places and aid him in this journey. That's a really fantastic story beat. Or for example, when you sneak into the Yiga clan base, that's a really fantastic story beat. A lot of the stuff dealing with the individual descendants of the champions were really good story beats. But the problem is, especially compared to the older games, those story beats are so far and few between in the long term. So I do understand why people have problems with the narrative. I don't think it's all bad. I think there's a lot to like, but I do understand. Now we move on to the plot, which I think is obviously nothing in art criticism is objective. It is as close as you can get to saying that the plot of Breath of the Wild is really bad. I think there are very few people, I don't know, maybe I'll be proven wrong in my comment section, but I think there are very few people who will justify the plot itself, the plot being the collection of narratives and how they fit together. The individual narrative beats are just so scattered and all over the place and individualized because of the open-endedness of the gameplay itself. They kind of have to be individualized, self-contained stories. But when you bring them all together, they don't have a lot of cohesion. It's almost like you went on 4 different little mini stories that had very little to actually do with each other. Not to mention, again, I'm just really going to bring this up again. So much of the story played out before your story even begins. It's not nearly as fun learning what happened as it is learning what is going to happen. It's not even remotely as fun. And I think there really is a problem with your plot when the majority of the exciting things happened before the story. So the plot is really bad and the narrative's a mixed bag, but like I said at the beginning, I don't think that the game has a bad story. And the reason I don't think the game has a bad story despite those things is because of just how good the tone of the game is and how fantastic the characters are. So starting with the tone of the game, it is so strong. Tonally and thematically, the game is pretty fantastic. There are so many independent themes that sort of are throughout the entire game, but also wrap up with each other. Take, for example, the theme of failure. There are so many different characters in Breath of the Wild that are dealing with the fact that they failed. Link failed to protect Zelda. Zelda failed to be able to save her kingdom. The champions failed to protect their people, and they also failed in their role as champions. Hyrule failed as a civilization. Like, all these individual layers of failure are one thing, it's also the fact that they interweave with each other, whereas the failures of the champions to their people are interwoven with the failures of the champions as champions. Link's failure to protect Zelda is also a failure of him as a champion. Zelda's failure to fulfill her role is also tied in with the failure of Hyrule as a civilization, and it's really impressive how they managed to sort of loop those together. And themes of redemption are explored as well. Almost every single character is trying to redeem themselves somehow. Sidon is trying to atone for what happened to Mipha. Riju is trying to win back the faith of the Gerudo people in the leadership that she offers. Link is trying to redeem the fact that he failed Princess Zelda. Princess Zelda is locked in an eternal battle with Ganon because she's trying to redeem the fact that she let everybody down. Like, even King Hyrule at the start knows that he failed as a king and is trying to redeem himself by making sure that you are as ready as you will be. And all of that just goes into my next point, which are how good the characters are in this game. They're so fantastic. I think the only game with stronger characters is probably Skyward Sword. the Breath of the Wild characters are phenomenal. Zelda is really, really good. I know that some people do have a problem with how, sort of complainy she is, but I think that put in her situation, it suits her character really well. And the fact that she does show pretty crazy amounts of emotional maturity is fantastic. The fact that Link has more character in this game than he really ever has before, without even saying a word, going from being stoic and serious to finally opening up to Zelda. And we see all of that develop just through the characterization of him. And then we move on to the champions. All 4 of them are really, really, really good. Starting with Mipha, she's just so nice. She's so pure. She's such a good, kind-hearted person. She's just such a great character. And then we move on to Urbosa. Urbosa's so awesome. She's probably my favorite champion. She seems like such a gruff person at the start, but then you see her be so soft and kind with Zelda, and then be so sort of friendly and encouraging to Link. It really is so fantastic how she seems like how she's a sort of deceptive character, seeming like she's not going to be a very nice person, and then seeing how warmly she treats her friends. Then we move on to Daruk. Daruk is probably the simplest character in the bunch, but he's just so aggressively likable. Yeah, his voice acting's pretty bad, but other than that, he's just like the ultimate bro. There's nothing to dislike about him. And then there's Ravalli. Obviously, you might not like Ravalli as a character, but that doesn't mean he's not a good character. I really dislike Frodo, but I'm not going to deny that he's a fantastic character. And that's really how I do feel about Ravalli. He's such an arrogant, proud, egotistical guy that just sort of gets on your nerves. But then you learn that despite that, he's willing to put all of that aside for the sake of the kingdom. And then you find out that the only reason he's so egotistical towards Link is the fact that he approached Link as a friend and then got really turned off by Link's sort of quiet, aloof, cold personality. So it really makes you think, while yes, he is an asshole, he's kind of only an asshole because Link was an asshole to him first. That's some pretty great stuff from what could be just a very generic character. And then you have sort of the descendants of the champions, which for the most part are really good. Who doesn't like Sidon? If you don't like Sidon, there's something seriously wrong with you. Every moment that he's on screen, he steals all of the attention, and it's for very good reason. He's just so alluring as a character. You have Riju. Riju might actually be my favorite character in the entire game. I find her arc of being, that sort of leader who got thrusted into the position way too young and is sort of struggling to win the respect of those people around her. I think that's such a fantastic character trope, and I don't think that they mess it up here. I think that Riju is fantastic. I really like her. And then you get into Yunobo. He's kind of lame. He's kind of funny and sweet, and I like the contrast of the descendant of Daruk being such a timid little guy, but, he is one of the weaker ones. And then you have Teva. Whatever. I don't even want to talk about Teva. He's just bland. So honestly, you have what? You have the 4 champions, you have the 4 descendants of the champions, and then you have Link and Zelda. So that's 10 characters, 10 pretty central characters. Only one of them is actually bad, that being Teba, and only one of them is kind of mediocre, that being Yunobo. The game is just full of such fantastic characters. And that's not even getting into the side characters that don't really have too much to do with the plot. Are you seriously gonna tell me with a straight face that you didn't fall head over heels for Paya, or even more head over heels for Bolson? If you deny it, you're a liar, good sir. You're a liar. So, honestly, that's the reason that I can't say that Breath of the Wild has a bad story. While yes, the narrative is all over the place, and the plot is pretty bad, the characters are so fantastic, and the themes of the game are so well implemented that I'm sorry if you are one of those people that think that the entire thing is badly written. I just don't agree. I'm willing to concede a lot of ground to you and say that they definitely did mess up in a lot of ways, but I just don't agree that the entire thing is bad. Too many fantastic characters, too many well implemented themes. I actually look forward to seeing what they do with the next one now that they have the sort of structure of their game worked out. Hopefully they can find a way to thread a sort of more consistent storyline through the game. Anyways, that's my opinion. Let me know what you think about the story in the game, and let me know if you have anything you want me to talk about next week. I'd be happy to take suggestions. Thanks for listening to this episode of Astral Observatory. If you missed the previous one, it'll be on the screen on the left pretty shortly here. If you want to check out my other Zelda series, Hyrule History, it'll be on the right. And if you like what you see and you want to give me some support, there's always the subscribe button. Thanks for watching, and remember, stay safe. It's dangerous to go alone.